Okay, everyone. So let's go ahead and continue with finishing up with chapter 2 here. Like I was explaining right now, the first half of chapter 2 was focusing more on democratic theory and the whole rationale behind constitutions and why we have them. Whereas the second half of this chapter is going to be narrowing in on the actual Texas Constitution and what are the components of it, and some of the criticisms that we've seen over the years in terms of how the Constitution is written. And we will be doing a little bit of a comparing and contrasting between the Texas Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. So that's what we're going to go ahead and take a look at here today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so let's see. It should. Okay, I'm trying to get for this to expand here. Okay, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, everyone. So, okay, so the computer's acting weird today. That's why it took me a little while to get started. The computer was very slow today. But okay, so let's go ahead and get started here in a bit. Now, as you can see from this chart, the Texas has had 7 of these constitutions since its inception, right? Since going back to the time when Texas was conjoined with the state of Coahuila, and then of course moving on to becoming its own independent republic, and then being admitted into the Union, and then leaving the Union as part of the Civil War. Now, most of the earlier ones we're not really going to focus too much on. Obviously, of course, when we look at the Civil War Constitution, pretty similar to what Texas had before as a state, only that they were adding more provisions to protect the institution of slavery, which is pretty much the main reason why Texas decided to join the Confederacy in the first place, right? To be able to maintain that that right to slavery that the Southern states were fighting the Civil War over. Then, of course, we had Reconstruction, the Reconstruction Constitution, where there were still some issues, right? The book talks about how the black codes were still being implemented, where African Americans were still being discriminated against, even though they had just gained their citizenship, with the abolishing of slavery through the post Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So obviously, of course, the Reconstruction wasn't occurring as intended. So that's why the radical Republicans came in with the radical Reconstruction Constitution. And these last two are the ones that we're really going to focus on here, which we've touched on them a bit, but let's kind of recap them, these last two, to really get a sense for why the Texas Constitution is the way it is. So let's kind of recap this a bit. I know we talked about this a little bit in chapter 1, but let's kind of expand on this. So Edmund J. Davis, E.J. Davis, who was a Unionist, he was a Texan, but he was a Texan that was in support of the Union. He did not go along with the Confederacy. So when he becomes governor, and remember that he becomes governor because a lot of the former Confederates in Texas were not allowed to vote at this time because of the Union control. So what he did was, once he got to power, he wanted to institute a system of government at the state level that resembled what was going on in Washington. What I mean by this is that he wanted to have the 3 branches of government in Texas. He wanted for them to be as closely resembling the federal branches of government as possible. So I mentioned before that when it came to the governorship, he wanted for the governorship to have the same type of powers that the president has. What I mean by that is, when it comes to like the appointment power that the president has. So if you've taken Government 2305, you'll know that the president has the appointment power to appoint members of his cabinet, appoint federal judges, and then those appointees have to then be confirmed by the Senate. We've seen this the last couple of years in real time, where there's been a lot of Supreme Court justices that have just gotten on the seat. Like there's been a major overhaul where almost half of the Supreme Court is new from not even 10 years ago. So you've seen, because former President Trump was able to get 3 Supreme Court appointees. Current President Biden was able to get 1. So you can see how there's been a lot of turnover within the Supreme Court, and so it's interesting to see that, because in real time, you've been able to see how that process plays out. The point of that, though, is that E.J. Davis wanted to have that same type of process in Texas, where he would make judicial appointments, as well as the high-ranking state executives, and then they would have to be confirmed by the state legislature. So he wanted for that process to occur. Now, keep in mind, remember we were talking about legitimacy a little while ago, right? Remember we discussed legitimacy last time, and how that if the people who are being governed do not feel that the laws and policies are moral, fair, and just, then society at large is going to have a problem. They're not going to agree with the vibe is not going to be good. You know, checking the temperature of the room, which is what I also like to say when you're in charge of a large group of people. I've always believed that it's important to check the temperature of the room. Um, Not necessarily, like if let's say like you're a supervisor or even like I've seen like where like these rabid fan bases will criticize, the creators of certain franchises, and then the creators will fire back and they'll be like, well, it's mine, I'm the one who created it. Well, yes, you did, but when your creation becomes so famous and it gets tons and tons and tons of fans, the fans are going to be very vocal about these things. And I'm not saying that you have to do exactly what the fans do or the fans say, but you do have to check the vibe. You do have to check the temperature of the room. And as an educator, I do the same way, right? Like if I'm in a class, and if all the class is mad at me, then I need to pay attention to that because there's more of them than they are of me. So I need to look at the vibes and and just how everything is going, so that things can be as harmonious as possible. So when you are in government, you do have to, I would say you have to do that as well. You have to check the temperature of of the constituents, and you have to try to see if you can get everyone to at least not be angry at you, right? Maybe they might not agree with you, or maybe they might not necessarily get everything that they want, but at least they're not like super angry with you. And I know in today's politics, that's a lot easier said than done. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that the vibe in Texas was very, very negative against EJ Davis and the radical Republicans because, for one thing, a lot of them weren't able to vote, so they didn't feel that this guy was legitimate. Um, Another thing was that they felt that the union was an occupying force, right? That because of all of these other things that were going on, right, where they weren't able to vote, they weren't, they felt that the government was basically overbearing and not allowing them to have this freedom, right? So there was a lot of negativity, a lot of bad feelings, a lot of bad emotions during this radical Reconstruction period. So ultimately, once Reconstruction ends, then the Democrats are able to take control because now they're able to vote again, and so they defeat E.J. Davis. There's actually an interesting video where that talks about the Texas Constitution, and the lady there in the video, she talks about how that there was, it wasn't a smooth, peaceful transition of power, right? Where E.J. Davis didn't want to leave the state capitol building, and he called in state troops, to barricade himself in there, and then ultimately he did leave. Um, but then he locked like the doors, to the office, so very, petty type of thing, so yeah, sometimes, politics can be very, very, there can be a lot of consternation there, right? January 6th is another example of that, but anyway, but the point is that once the radical Republicans are removed from office, the longtime conservative Democrats take over, and they pass the 1876 Constitution, which is the Constitution that we currently have today, right? So that's what we're going to be focusing on here throughout the rest of this chapter, is the current Constitution and why it is the way it is. So as you're going to see here, you're going to see that the current Texas Constitution is as far away from the radical Republican Constitution as possible. Again, as I've said before, right, there's a lot of corollaries between the type of anger and the type of frustration that the Texas Democrats felt towards the Republicans in Texas. A lot of similar feelings that the American colonists had towards Great Britain, or the original Anglo-Texans had against the Mexican centralized government, right? That they wanted to get as far away from a strong centralized government as possible, and they wanted to diffuse that power more towards local communities and things like that. So they did not want to have the state government look like a miniature version of the federal government. So I hope that makes sense, that they wanted to get as far away from having the governor have, too much power, having, like that was their main concern, is to not have a strong executive. Um, and they also didn't want to have a legislature that was constantly meeting like Congress was. So we're going to see how, yes, we do have the three branches of government, but there are differences when it comes to how these three branches operate here. Okay, so let's take a look at the present Texas Constitution. Okay, so after the let's see, it's okay, it's upstream here. Okay, so after the radical Reconstruction period, Texas reformed its constitution and was sure to reincorporate several of the following principles. So again, the major theme within our current state constitution is limiting government. Okay, so this first one, limiting the governorship to only 2-year terms. Now, this was changed a little bit later on with an amendment to the state constitution, where now governors serve for 4 years. But originally, governors only served for 2 years at the original time of the 1876 Texas Constitution. State dealing set state debt ceiling of only 200,000. We're also going to talk about later on how Texas also is what you would call a balanced budget state, where they cannot run on a deficit. You know how like the United States, you're probably seeing they have like the debt clock, where where the United States is like several trillion dollars in debt, and it just keeps adding and things like that. So the state does not, Texas does not have the ability to operate that way. And of course, one of the main reasons for that is because the state can't coin its own money. So yes, the United States, and I don't want to get into the whole economic theory of whether the United States should be operating on a debt or not. But the point is that they're able to, because of their ability to coin money, for better or for worse. But states cannot coin their own money, so they do have to make sure that every dollar that is spent has to be allocated for, right? That when the state comes up with their budget, that every dollar is accounted for when they're putting forth the state budget. So even at the beginning of the state constitution, they were very wary of owing money, of any kind here. We also have the biennial legislative session. So not annual, but biennial. So what this means here is that the state legislature only meets once every 2 years, and that is going to be in odd numbered years. So the state legislature is going to be meeting again next spring. Well, actually, it's more like towards the tail end of the winter, but then moving into spring. So basically, like the spring semester is what I like to call it, and they usually meet until May. So they start in January and they meet until May, at least in the regular session. So I like to call it, it's like for a spring semester, basically. But we will talk about this here in a bit, how unlike Congress, the Texas legislature only meets once every 2 years for a couple of months, and they got to get all that work allocated for and done over the next year and a half, until the legislature will meet again 2 years later. I say a year and a half because half a year passes from when the legislature starts in January all the way until May. So you could count that about like half a year. So a year and a half until the next legislative meeting will happen. Very few appointments by the governor. Now, the governor in more recent years, the governor has had a lot more appointee power, where the governor has more numerous appointments, but the governor does not appoint the governor does not appoint too many high-ranking officials. And what I mean by that is, we'll talk about the plural executive right now, where the governor does not appoint lieutenant governor. The governor does not appoint the comptroller or the commissioner general land office, the attorney general. The governor does not appoint those people. Those people are elected by, independently from the government. We'll talk about that more here. And also, of course, a tolerance for racial segregation, right? So obviously, of course, this is still a major problem in Texas. And as we discussed in the first chapter, when we talk about Texas history, unfortunately, this was the nature of Texas. Even several lynchings occurred in Texas. Because when people talk about like lynchings, they might think of like more southern states, but in Texas, there was still several of those incidences, like the Jesse Washington lynching in Waco in, I think it was 1917 or some of the at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's been several of these incidences, unfortunately, that have happened in Texas. And of course, the reason for that was because of the culture of continued racial segregation and racial discrimination against, and not just African Americans, but also Hispanics as well. Also, were heavily discriminated in Texas as well. So unfortunately, that is what it is in terms of the history of the state here. Okay, so let's talk about the some of these general features, and most of this is, as you're going to see, is kind of a little bit critical here. So, and again, let me just go ahead and take another drink of water here really quickly. Excuse me. Okay, so when we look at the general features of the Texas Constitution, you're going to see that a lot of this tends to be um, rather negatively looked at. And the reason for this is because it's looking at it from the lens of efficiency. So, regardless of whether you like the way this Constitution is laid out, and again, and we will talk about how there are some positives to it, but if we're looking at it from this idea of, okay, is it an efficient Constitution? Is it easier to get things done? Is it easier on the lawmakers to be able to interpret? The answer to that would definitely be no, because take a look at the general features here. So there's many details of policy. What we mean by this is that, and again, like I said, if we had more time, I would definitely walk you all through the state constitution. It is located in the resources. Again, I'm not asking you all to read through it. Maybe just kind of skim through it a bit, and you'll see that there's a ton of, there's a ton of articles in there. And if you actually read through the Texas Constitution, you'll see that there's a lot of very specific, nuanced type of provisions that only affect like certain areas, certain regions, like certain counties. And we're going to talk about how we also see this within the amendments to the state constitution. Let me give you an example. So I know I wanted to save this for when we talk about the amendments, but this will be a good example to kind of open this discussion up here. So a couple of years ago, when I was voting in the state constitutional amendment election, there was an amendment in there. I think it was, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but anyway, there was an amendment there where it was discussing whether to abolish an office in Galveston County. And I'm like, what do what do I have to do with Galveston County? I've been there before. I actually went, I actually was there a couple of months ago, this past summer, but I'm not a resident of Galveston County. I don't pay taxes there. What does it matter what I think in terms of whether they should have that office around or not? It was like a county level office, whether it should be abolished or not. And my thought was, like I said, what does it matter to me? And if, let's say, I did live in Galveston County, would I want for the rest of the state to basically getting in our local business and deciding, would I want people, in El Paso deciding for me whether a certain local office in my county was going to be around or not? You see how that might be something where people might not really be too happy about. I know for me, I certainly wouldn't be happy about that. Let's say there was a constitutional amendment, to do something here like in Hidalgo County. I certainly would not want people outside of Hidalgo County, influencing whether that would happen, because they're not going to feel anything. I'm going to feel it, regardless of, in terms of how that decision goes or not. So do I really want for people outside of the county to be deciding things for me? I would probably say no, So again, I'm just giving you an example of how very specific how specific some of these provisions are within the state constitution. The book talks about how there's something in Chambers County or something like that. That's over in East Texas, I think it's near like Huntsville or something like that. So again, dealing with some local affairs there that was put forth for the whole state to decide on. So that's just to show you how quirky the state constitution can be, right? So there's, again, many details of policy where it goes very, very lengthy, and just has a lot of wordage in terms of the policies, right? It's almost like they don't get to the point here. It's just very, very long. Checks on government authority. Again, this is not something that, people have different opinions about this, whether some people like the idea that the Constitution is very laid out, it's very wordy, and it really isn't open to interpretation. So, state officials can't go, and it's harder for them to go and do something because they have to make sure that it falls in line with the state constitution. Now, again, some people would say that that's a good thing, and I could definitely see that argument as well. And in some cases, I would definitely agree as well. Um, again, but again, going back to my point of, is that an efficient way to govern? Again, it's going to take longer for the state reps and the state senators to read through the Constitution. It's going to take longer for them to be able to determine whether this bill they want to introduce is constitutional. So it is going to take a lot more time. And also keep in mind that the legislature only meets for a few months every 2 years, so they got to get everything done. That's why, you know, if you're a state rep and you're getting ready to start the state, if you're gonna, let's say you're gonna be, you're a state representative and you're gonna be going to Austin in January to serve in the legislature, you're probably gonna have to spend your Christmas break probably reading up on the Constitution and getting all your bills ready to go on the first day, which is totally understandable. I mean, we do something similar when we set up our classes. We have to have our classes set up on the first day, which, that means a lot of unpaid work. But it is what it is. Okay, so very long and poorly organized, right? So like I was explaining, right? It's got a lot of details. It's hard to find things. It's just, again, like I said, if I was a state rep, it'd be very difficult for me to try to read through that whole thing. That's why what I would do is I would get like my staffers and I'd be like, okay, you take this section, you take this article, you take this article, you take this article, then we'll meet back here like tomorrow and we'll kind of, or maybe not tomorrow, maybe we'll meet back in a week and then we'll kind of summarize it here a little bit. So you kind of have to do something like that if it's such a lengthy document and things like that, if you've never seen it before. No clear lines of responsibility for government authorities. This is a big problem within the executive branch where the governor is severely limited because of the different agencies and the different boards that the agencies answer to. Like, education is a great example. So we have like the Texas Education Agency, but we also have the state. Texas Education Agency is the state agency responsible for overseeing the school districts, but we also have the State Board of Education that also oversees K through 12 education in Texas. So you see how there's different boards that also overlap with the state agencies. It's extremely confusing of in terms of how power is actually delegated throughout the state, and the responsibilities usually do overlap with these agencies and with these boards here. Again, highly restrictive document. So in several provisions, the state constitution will use, I've said this before, they use like glass half empty approaches where it's not necessary. They don't say the state legislature will do this or can do this. Instead, it'll be like the state legislature cannot do this, cannot do that. So again, this is a holdover from how angry people were in 1875 and leading into 1876. They did not want, they wanted as little government involvement as possible, just do the bare minimum. So saying that, not to give any inch of power to government, right? That no, you are not allowed to do this. You are not allowed to do that. And so we see that we see that culture still permeate to this day, where government is looked at very suspiciously in Texas and things like that. Difficult to interpret even by the courts. Like I said, it's very lengthy. There's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of it's not necessarily that it's hard to read, because I've read through a lot of it. It's just that it's hard to remember because there's so many specifics in there. It's why and I won't shy away from telling you all this, that so I teach both government and history. I teach history at UTRGV. I'll be honest with you, I much rather prefer teaching government, because with history, there's so many things you have to remember. You have to remember all these battles. You have to remember all of these events, and it's just and a lot of times the events and the battles don't really. It's just a bunch of fact memorization. You kind of basically have to be like a walking Wikipedia article, and that's not easy to do, right? To have to to have to so when I prep for my two classes, whether it's government or history, I find that teaching government is much easier. It's much more straightforward. It's more conceptualized. Yes, you do have to know facts and information, but it's more theory based, right? Whereas with history, it's basically just a bunch of memorization of events and things. And yes, they do build upon each other. And yes, it is important to know why these events are important. Like, you have to understand why the Treaty of Versailles was important and the impact that it would later have on Nazi Germany. Yes, of course, obviously you do have to be able to connect the dots there, but you still have to know what the Treaty of Versailles is. You still have to know, what all these events were, right? So in my opinion, that's what I kind of compare, like when you compare the U.S. Constitution with the Texas Constitution. The U.S. Constitution would be like teaching government, and the Texas Constitution would be like teaching history, because there's just uh, so many more facts, and so many more just things you have to remember in the Texas Constitution, right? So even the courts, even the judges who are supposed to be like experts on this, even they have trouble interpreting this and determining a whether this law is constitutional or not. It's definitely something that can be very difficult. Okay, so those are the general features. Now let's go to the specific features. Now there is a state Bill of Rights incorporated from the U.S. Constitution, and this is located at the very beginning of the state constitution. You will if you go through it, you'll be able to find it's right there at the beginning, and you'll see that a lot of these rights are mirrored from the U.S. Bill of Rights here. Let me see if I can stop the show. Let me see if I can show this to you. Hold on. Yeah, let me go ahead and open up the state constitution here. Let's see. Let's see. Did I have Blackboard open? I think I did. Hold on. Give me just a moment. Let me see, because that way you all can see for yourself. Let me open up Blackboard here really quick. I thought I had it open. Yeah, but basically what I want to do here really quick is I want to show you all. Let me go ahead and open up the state constitution here, so that way we can do a comparison here. And like I said, if you definitely do have time, or let's say you want to fall asleep or something like that, definitely open up the state constitution, and maybe that'll do that. But yeah, let me go ahead and it should still be here. I believe it's still here. Let's see. I don't see why it wouldn't be here, because I did upload it for y'all. So let me see. Let's see, state constitution. Let's see. It's supposed to be here. Okay, wait, no, that's the YouTube video. That is so weird. I could have sworn that it was that, because I know I had uploaded it here. Okay, well, if it's not, then I need to upload it again. Okay, so let me just do a quick Google search, because there is a PDF for it somewhere here, and so let me do that for you really quickly. Hold on. I know there is a PDF for it. Okay, let's see. Okay, perfect. Okay, I found it here. Okay, so let me go ahead and share the screen again. Okay, so sorry about that. I thought it was listening in the resources, so I'll make sure to upload this here as well. So as you can see here is a PDF of the state constitution. Okay, and as you can see here, look how many pages it is. Down, 207, 200 and what is it, 70? Yeah, 273 pages here. So again, like I said, this would take us probably at least a month to go over this more specifically. Look, I already saw something here talking about Harris County. Like, again, as I've said before, that this constitution is very specific in terms of the when it's talking about specific regions and specific locations here. I don't know. I can't find it anymore, because it's just way too lengthy. But I did see Harris County right here. There's something about the city of Potter there. See, or the county of Potter. So you see how they're talking about over in Amarillo, which I've been there, and it's a nice location. But again, if I'm living in Amarillo, what would it matter what someone over here in South Texas thinks? So, but let's go to the beginning. Okay, so let's go to the Bill of Rights here. So it's going to be located here at the beginning, right? So you see how it's right here. It's the first article here. The first article is the State Bill of Rights. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so if you recall from if you've taken Government 2305, you'll know that a lot of this sounds familiar, right? Let's take a look at let's take a look at freedom of speech and press, right? Searches and seizures, right? So this is your First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. This is your Fourth Amendment, right? Rights of accused, right? So we're talking about like the Fifth Amendment right here. So you see how bail is also in the Eighth Amendment, although there are some differences, right? So there are some additions to the state constitution, such as equal rights. They've been trying to pass an equal rights amendment for the U.S. Constitution in the 1970s. It gained some steam, but it wasn't able to make it. In Texas, we do have the equal rights provision and all that. Okay, anyway, so let's go ahead. So again, I just wanted to show this to y'all really quickly so y'all can see that the Texas Bill of Rights does, is basically incorporates what we have from the U.S. Constitutional Bill of Rights, but also has some additions here. Okay, so let's go ahead and let me stop the share here, and then we'll go back to the PowerPoint here. So, like I said, I'll make sure that that gets uploaded. I could have sworn that that was in the in the resources, but if it's not, that's okay. I'll go ahead and upload that right now. So, okay, so let me go ahead and get to the share here in a bit. Okay, let's see. Where's okay. So I've been using this for years and it's still confusing. Okay. Now we do have also checks and balances here within our state constitution. And what we mean by this, of course, if we're looking at the checks and balances at the national level, we do see that when it comes to like the government, when it comes like the president being able to veto bills brought forth to them from from Congress, that's at the federal level. So in Texas, we have the same process, right? Where when the legislature passes bills, it does have to go to the governor's desk to be signed. Now, we are going to talk about how that there is one difference. We'll talk about this when we get to the governorship. The item veto or the line item veto, there's different names for it, but so that's a different type of veto where the governor can, because if you know about the way the lawmaking process is when it gets to like the president's desk or the governor's desk, or we'll talk about the president's desk. So the president's desk, the president cannot make any changes to it, right? The president can only either sign into law, veto it, saying he's not going to sign into law, or there's also pocket vetoes, or if the governor or if the president, sorry, just ignores it, then it could become law for 10 days or things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that the president can't go and say, you know what, I'm only going to pass this portion. Now, the governor can do that with appropriations bills, bills having to do with money. So what the governor can do, the governor can strike out certain portions of it, right? He can say, you know what, I'm not gonna fund this. I'm not gonna approve for this to be funding. And the governor actually was threatening to do this back in 2021 when we had the incident when the Texas Democrats in the state legislature fled to Washington um, because the governor was calling special sessions. We'll have more time to go over that a little bit later in the class. But Governor Abbott back then was threatening to not pay the legislators and the staffers for the ones who had left. So he was using that as a as a punishment for them doing it, and as a threat to get them back to to Austin and all that. So the governor can do that, where the governor can decide he's not going to be in favor of certain provisions within the appropriations bill being funded here. Okay, legislative branch. So list restrictions rather than powers, like I was talking about here before. That again, that the legislature is not going to be allowed to. Let's say an example would be like to not pass a law creating a state income tax, because the state constitution has been very adamant about Texas not having a state income tax. In fact, a couple of years ago, that provision was strengthened. It had already been part of Texas law, but it had been strengthened even more so with this more recent state amendment to the state constitution. Because I think I mentioned this before, right? That Texas does not have a state income tax. Most states do. Excuse me. In most states, when you're doing your taxes in April, you have to do both your federal and your state income taxes. But instead, Texas doesn't have one. Now, of course, as I also mentioned before, Texas is able to get the tax revenue in other ways, such as higher property taxes. So when people say that Texas is a low tax state, yes, it's low tax for certain taxes, but it's also higher in other areas. So just keep that in mind that, like my grandpa would always say, the government always gets their money one way or another. So, it just is what it is, right? Okay, executive branch. Okay, let's talk about the plural executive. This is one of the most important concepts within Texas government. As I told you all before, when I've had interviews at other colleges in the past for Texas government, they this is the big question that they'll usually have me do a teaching demonstration on is give us a lesson on the plural executive. So that just goes to show you just how important the plural executive is. So let's go ahead and discuss this. And this is going to be a recurring theme that we're going to see throughout Government 2306 is the plural executive. We're going to reference it almost every chapter from now on. So you definitely will know what the plural executive is once you're done with this class here. The plural executive is basically the way the executive branch is set up. So remember how I was talking about a little while ago that the governor does not appoint the high-ranking state officials like lieutenant governor? That's what the plural executive is, where it's plural, right? Where it's multiple people who have authority independent from each other within the state executive, within the state executive branch. What we mean by that is that yes, the governor is usually looked at as the top, right? You know, it's definitely the position that gets the most attention, but the lieutenant governor does not answer to the governor. So Dan Patrick is the current lieutenant governor. He does not answer to Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott cannot tell Dan Patrick what to do. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't try to work together, especially because they're members of the same political party. They definitely want to try to be on the same page to try to put forth Republican-inspired policies that they want to pursue. So it definitely makes sense that they would definitely be, you know, try to be on the same page, try to have a good close working relationship because they have to, right, in order to get stuff done. But Greg Abbott, let's say Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick disagreed on something, which does happen from time to time. Greg Abbott cannot go and fire Dan Patrick like Trump used to do many years ago when he would let go of his cabinet. A lot of people were comparing it to like his time on like The Apprentice, so they were calling it like, you know, cabinet apprentice, you know, presidential apprentice. You know, they were making they were making fun of it in the media several years ago. But the point is that in Texas, that's not allowed. Like Greg Abbott cannot, you know, dismiss Dan Patrick or, you know, when it comes to these other people, you know, when it comes to like Ken Paxton, the attorney general. And we will talk about some of the issues that he's had in terms of some legal issues recently and his impeachment that happened recently. Wasn't removed, but was impeached here. So we'll talk about that when we get to the when we get to that chapter. But the point is that Governor Abbott cannot dismiss these people, right? Governor Abbott cannot dismiss the members of the executive branch because they are independently elected. So the next state elections are not going to be until 2026. So in 2026, you will see that, right? You will see that all of these state executive offices are going to be up for re-election, you know. So it's not just the governor, right? It's also going to be lieutenant governor, comptroller, commissioner general land office, as well as some positions within some state boards, like I said, the State Board of Education, the Texas Railroad Commission. But those positions within the executive branch are elected instead of appointed, right? So Greg Abbott does not appoint the lieutenant governor, the comptroller, or the attorney general like the president of the United States does. Instead, those positions are independently elected. Okay, let's go to the judicial branch. It's a confusing list of 6 types of courts. So what this means here is, and again, and all of these are going to have their own specific chapters where we're going to go more into detail on this. But the judicial branch, basically, it's confusing because we have what's called overlapping jurisdiction. What this means is that what overlapping jurisdiction is where like you'll have 2 levels of courts that are responsible for the same type of offenses or the same type of civil disagreements. What I mean by this is, let's say you get let's say DPS pulls you over and they issue you like a $300 citation and they send you to like a justice of the peace or something like that. They could send you to a justice of the peace, or maybe they could send you to like a county court at law or something like that. So the point I'm trying to make is that you see how that's what the overlapping jurisdiction is that it could be multiple courts that could take your case. Now, the main reason why they do this is to make the judicial system a little bit more efficient so that you don't just have one court taking so many cases. They try to balance it all out so that like let's say you've got courts in Hidalgo County, they'll try to balance it all out where you've got, you know, this justice of the peace doesn't have an overwhelming number of cases compared to this one over here. So they try to balance it out. But it does create a situation where it's extremely confusing for individuals who are trying to find out what court has their case, right? And like I said, we're going to go more into detail on this in this chapter as well as in the judicial branch chapter as well. And then, of course, local government, home rule, of course, is an important concept where cities are able to craft their own city charters, and they can, as long as, of course, as they're in compliance with the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution, cities can, they have a little bit more flexibility compared to counties. Counties don't have home rule set up, but cities do. And what I mean by this is that the cities can decide, okay, you know what, we're going to have a city manager or not, or we're going to decide how our city council is going to be set up, where it's going to be an at-large election where just the top 4 vote getters get on the city council, or we're going to set up precincts where only people that live in that precinct can vote for that specific city council seat. So you see how the state is not going to tell the cities how to set up their government. The cities themselves will do so. Because, and again, and it makes sense because that's not really it. That's something that the cities can decide for themselves in terms of, okay, we can decide for ourselves in terms of how we're going to elect our officials and things like that. It's not something that the state is going to micromanage. Although with the counties, they do micromanage that. And then, of course, we'll also take a look at the suffrage and the amendments here in terms of the way the state constitution is amended here. So, okay, so let's go ahead and get through this really quick because I know we're already kind of getting close to the end of the time here. Let's see. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the present Texas Constitution here. And let me just see how much. Let me see. Let me hide this over here. Let me see how much more we have. So, okay, yeah, okay, we can probably knock this out in. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, maybe 20, 25. If I need to go over a couple of minutes, I shouldn't be too bad. And like I said, for those of you who have to leave, I understand. Okay. Okay, executive branch. So again, full executive, like we were discussing right now here. As you can see here, these are the state executive positions, and we're going to go into detail on what these positions do. We will talk about the lieutenant governor and how they're basically. The lieutenant governor is interesting because even though technically they are part of the executive branch, in actuality, their job description is actually more so like a legislator, because the lieutenant governor is basically the person that's in charge of the state senate. So in Congress, the people who are in charge of the state senate well, the person who's ultimately has the most power in the senate is the Senate majority leader. So lieutenant governor is basically taking the role of the Senate majority leader that we would see in the federal government system, and they are doing that in Texas. We'll talk about what they do, like setting the calendar and deciding, who's going to be on the committees and all that stuff. But for now, what I want you all to understand is that lieutenant governor is basically in charge of the state senate. So you could make an argument that that's kind of another example of federalism, where how we talked about with federalism before, how you want to, you want to have like the different levels of government, kind of diffuse power amongst each other. So you can make an argument that this is kind of like a subset of federalism, where you have the executive branch being active within the legislative branch. So you could kind of make an argument that it's kind of like another example, like a further subdivided example of federalism here. So I do find that very interesting that you've got someone in the executive who's actually more of a legislator. I do think that's kind of interesting. Of course, the comptroller is the state executive official that's basically in charge of the money. They're responsible for the accounts and making sure that the state, the money that is spent by the state is accounted for. Other positions like Commissioner General Land Office. So Texas does have a lot of state land that usually gets leased out to like oil companies and things like that. So the Commissioner General Land Office is responsible for overseeing that. Attorney General is considered the top attorney, top law enforcement official within the state, and they're responsible for interpreting the Constitution whenever there's issues going on with, like I mentioned, if a bill, to make sure that the bill is constitutional, that's called an advisory opinion. The Attorney General also represents the state whenever Texas gets sued by the federal government, which happens a lot more often than you might realize. They're also in charge of the Office of the Attorney General. Also is in charge of the I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen job postings for this, but they're also in charge of like the child support collection in Texas. So they have those people that work for the state that do that. We also have the Texas Railroad Commission, which when we get to them, what's interesting is that the Texas Railroad Commission today, and I'll never forget this. My professor that I took government 2036, he taught me this. He taught me like, like what, like the Texas Railroad Commission, but yet they oversee oil and natural gas in Texas. How does that make sense, right? Well, the reason for that is because of history. That originally the Texas Railroad Commission was involved in regulating the railroads. Whether they did a good job of that, going back to the Grange movement, that's a whole other story. But then once the railroads kind of stopped being the major industry in Texas and oil became a major industry, then the Railroad Commission took on that role. So that's why it happened, because of originally they were overseeing railroads mostly, but then oil showed up on the scene, and so then they took it. So instead of creating a new commission, which might have been a little bit more, would have been a little bit less confusing if they had just decided to create the Texas Oil Commission, but that's why the Texas Railroad Commission is still looked at as one of the top, if not one of the top commissions in the state, because of the enormous industry that the oil industry is in Texas. Commissioner of Agriculture, of course, as I mentioned before, Texas still has a lot of land, a lot of farming, a lot of grazing, a lot of obviously, of course, a lot of agriculture, right? So we have a commissioner for that to oversee the the farms and the food production, such as, and of course, the federal government also is involved in that, like with the USDA. So there is a lot of there's supposed to be a lot of cooperation between the federal government and the states when it comes to the overseeing of farms, making sure that that the cows are inspected, so that the beef that people consume is as safe as possible, as well as the crops, the harvest, that they're not being sprayed with too many pesticides and insecticides and all that stuff, because that could be a cancer risk. And of course, as I mentioned, the State Board of Education, which oversees K through 12 education within the state. Now, there is another board that oversees higher education, which is called the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, but that is not an elected board. So remember, all of these are members of the POA executive, because all of these positions, as it says here, are elected independently in statewide elections, right? So the governor does not appoint any of these people. These people are independently elected from the governor. And for the State Board of Education, the way they set up their seats is by region, where depending on where you live in Texas, that's going to be the region that you are going to be. That's going to be the region that the state board is going to cover in terms of that specific region. That's going to be your State Board of Education representative there. Okay, strengthen governor powers. So again, like we talked about before, the 2-year term has been extended to 4 years. So now governors serve for 4-year terms. The ability to remove individuals they have appointed. So yes, so the way it works is that if the governor did not appoint you, then the governor cannot remove you. Now, this isn't really a problem nowadays, because Governor Abbott has been in power for, what is it? It's definitely, it's already going to be, well, it's definitely over a decade now, right? So anyone who could be appointed has already been appointed, because the positions, no one gets a 10-year appointment, right? It's usually like a 4-year appointment. So there's been enough of those appointment cycles that have gone by that anyone who's in a position where the governor can appoint, and appoint is a fancy term for hire, basically, and anyone who the governor hires, once the governor appoints those people, they can be let go. But the point is that you're not going to have a situation where someone who was appointed by someone other than Greg Abbott, it's not going to happen. Now, let's say if in 2022, let's say Beto O'Rourke had defeated Greg Abbott, and let's say he was governor, then he would have a hard time with the appointees, because he hadn't been in the office long enough. There would still be a bunch of people that would still need to finish out their appointment term. Again, this is not like the way it is in Washington, right? Where the president can basically fire anyone, Well, what I mean by that is that, let's say there's a new administration coming in, then the people at the top are not going to ever usually be the same. It's going to be, different people that are going to be coming in. So when the president comes in, it's also a new cabinet. It's also a new administrative staff within the White House. But in Texas, it's not so easy to do that. Increase control over major policy boards, such as insurance regulation and public education. Like I mentioned, so in more recent years, the governor has gotten a lot more power when it comes to the appointing of boards. not the major boards like the State Board of Education or the Railroad Commission, but more, I don't want to say lesser boards, but boards that are more, they're not as how would I say it? Their job is not, it's a little bit more nuanced. Like there'll be like law, like boards that serve like for the TCOL, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement Standards, like the law enforcement board. Like it's mentioning here, the insurance regulation. There's also boards having to do with like local government studies, things that people don't really know about. The less the less, these are less known boards, right? Not to say that they're not important. Like I said, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board is one of these. It is very important, right? Because overseeing college and university education within the state of Texas is very important, but it doesn't get the type of attention that like the State Board of Education does, because that, of course, is a little bit more pronounced. Because unlike college, which is not mandatory, K through 12 education is mandatory, so it's going to get a lot more attention. And control of the Texas Office of Homeland Security. So we will definitely talk more about how Governor Greg Abbott has definitely made Homeland Security and it makes sense. He was the former Attorney General, so he moved up to governor. So it makes sense that he's bringing a law enforcement background to the state, to the state governorship, because of his previous experience, being a longtime attorney and being within the legal / criminal justice field for pretty much his entire life. So it makes sense that would be something that he would be very knowledgeable and big on, right? Regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the methods that he takes. I just want for y'all to understand in terms of why why border security and just in general, criminal justice reform and things like that, why that is a big hallmark of his administration, because of his, so it makes sense because of his professional background. Okay, so let's see if we can get through this real quick. Yeah, probably gonna have to go maybe a few minutes over, but let's see if we can try to get through this really quick. Okay, so the judicial branch. Okay, so organization, like I mentioned, it says this phrase again, right? The confusing pattern of 6 types of courts. There's a lot more courts here than in the federal level. So at the federal level, it's a lot more straightforward. If we look at the federal level of courts, you only have 3 levels. You've got your federal district courts, which those are your entry level courts. So these are courts if you violate some sort of federal law, such as immigration law and being an undocumented immigrant. Obviously, of course, you will have violated federal law, and you're going to have to go before a district court judge. And it's usually going to be a judge that deals primarily with immigration, right? They usually try to they try to have certain what I'm trying to say is that they try to designate certain federal judges to specialize in immigration law, things like that. So, but yeah, so that's going to be your district court. Then the next level court is your appellate court. That's going to be your circuit court. So every state in the United States is part of a circuit. So here in Texas, we're part of the 5th Circuit that has their headquarters in New Orleans, Louisiana. So Texas is part of the 5th Circuit. So that would happen if you wanted to appeal your case, you would have to go to the 5th Circuit. Then, and again, and this is a big if, because this rarely happens. What I mean by this is that the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest court, that's the 3rd level, that would be the next level that you could try to appeal to. But there's an asterisk to that, because the Supreme Court is very selective with the cases that they take. They usually take only about 100 cases per year out of, let's say, like 10,000 petitions that they get. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court is focused not necessarily on hearing appeals, but more so trying to solve constitutional issues, right? So, if let's say you just want to appeal because you just didn't like the decision, that's really not going to get you that far, because there has to be a compelling constitutional reason for why you feel that this conviction was wrong. So in actuality, in terms of practicality, it's really only 2 levels for the most part. But again, but if we're looking at it, technically it is 3. But in Texas, there's 6 types of courts. We've got, entry level courts, like your municipal courts, your county courts, and then of course you also have your district courts, which are the ones we tend to think of when we think of like, what we see like in Law and Order, like, like your index crimes, like your murder rate, those go to the district courts. But then we also have like appellate courts, we also have appellate courts all the way up to, Texas has two highest courts. We've got the Court of Criminal Appeals and the Texas Supreme Court. So even then, so you see how it's really confusing because, and again, this goes back to the overlapping jurisdiction that we were talking about here, right? Each level of trial courts has concurrent overlapping jurisdiction with other courts, and we will talk about how that, like I said, that it's mostly based on trying to even things out at the at the different levels. But like I said, depending on, and again, it depends on the severity of the incident. So the severity of the crime. So if, let's say if you get charged with murder, you're not going to go to like a justice of the peace, right? Because they just deal with very routine things, like let's say you stole beer from HEB or something like that, right? So obviously, of course, that's going to be something, because the punishment is going to fit the crime, right? Because the crime is not very severe. The punishment's not going to be that severe, and the setting is not going to be that severe, right? It's not going to be as consequential. But if you commit like the worst crime that you commit, then of course it's going to go to the district court, because, and we're also going to see how the higher up you go, the more training and certifications and education and work experience that the judges have, because they're dealing with more serious issues. But yeah, so but again, it does depend on the crime and the overlapping jurisdiction, and the money. So we're also going to talk about how if you get sued, depending on the dollar amount of the lawsuit, that'll also determine which level of court you can go to. But it could also, but again, it could be multiple ones. So there is, you're going to see what I'm talking about, where like, let's say it's like for a couple thousand, it could be a county court, it could be maybe even a district judge could take it. Again, I've said before that what they do is they try to have the higher dollar amounts go, to the more qualified judges. So like I said, if you're getting sued for like several, hundreds of thousands of dollars, yeah, it's most likely going to go to a district judge because the amount is a lot higher. But let's say it's kind of like in the middle. Let's say it's at the middle between going to a district judge or going to or going to like a justice of the peace or something like that. So then that could be a little bit confusing because then you're not sure which. And in that case, then they usually look at the dockets and like, okay, like the district judge is a little bit more busy, so let's send it over to the let's send it over to the justice of the peace here. Okay, and then of course qualifications here, no requirements for legal training for the lower level judges, right? District judge and above, you do have to have your Juris Doctorate law degree, and you do have to have years of experience. But for justice of the peace, municipal judges, they do not actually require that. So people could run for justice of the peace if they wanted to, and they could become those judges. Of course, keep in mind that you're not going to be able to hear very high profile cases because that would require to be at a higher level of judgeship. But then and the book talks about how it might become a situation where it becomes just a popularity contest because judges are elected, right? So all judges in Texas are elected from from those lower levels all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, right? So judges in Texas are elected. This is a major difference from the federal level, where at the federal level, federal judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So, but in Texas, judges are elected. So this is a very, and I'm sure some of you have seen those signs, right? You've seen that. I've seen several signs already. There was a sign for U.S. Court of Appeals judge. You've probably seen some of those signs already because we're coming up on the November election, right, where the Democrats and the Republicans were going to be competing against each other. So we will have a few of those more localized elections, pitting Republicans and Democrats against each other. But yeah, you've probably seen some of those signs. You will see a lot more of those signs during the primary season, like we saw at the beginning of the year. I'm sure you all recall that there was a bunch of those signs. So there's not as many now because since this is a more Democrat controlled area, you're not going to see as many competitive elections between Republicans and Democrats, and the opposite is true up north. If you're in a more Republican area, you probably won't see too many political signs because there's not going to be too many Democrats running against the establishment Republicans there in that part of the state. So, but anyway, that's something that we can talk about a little bit later. Okay, so let's talk about local government here. So, okay. And again, keep in mind that there's going to be chapters for all of these. There's a chapter on the Texas legislature. There's a chapter on the executive branch with the governorship, as well as the state executive. So there's actually two chapters on that. There's a chapter on the Texas judiciary, and there's also a chapter on local government. So county, cities / municipalities. Municipalities is a fancy way to call cities, and special districts. So again, and we will just and we will discuss these three types of local governments when we get to that local government chapter. So counties are considered the most restricted. What we mean by this is that, and we will go more detail on this when we get to the local government chapter, is that counties, they don't have the home rule provision that the cities do. So let's talk about the cities first, and then we'll go back to counties. So because that's a good way to describe it. So the cities have a workable home rule provision. So like I mentioned earlier, that when the cities, when they apply to become a city, when they get their city charter approved, the cities have some leeway in terms of how they're going to set up their city government. Like I mentioned, there's differences. Some cities have the different city government setups, like the council manager, mayoral council. We're going to go into detail on all those when we get to that chapter. But like I said, an example I like to use is, like, let's say the way they elect their city council members. Some cities have a setup where it's just, they have a citywide election, and it's the top 4 vote getters. So everybody gets to vote for those positions. And it's basically, like a first come, first serve type of election. Whereas other cities have the precinct system where, let's say the city's divided up into 4 precincts. So those 4 seats are going to be allocated based on who lives in those precincts, right? So city council member number 1 is going to come from the number 1 precinct. So only people that live in the number 1 precinct can vote for that city council seat. Does that make sense? That if you live on the other side of the city, you're not going to be able to vote for that city council seat. And that is the way that the counties are set up, where when you have the county commissioners, they have it set up where there's 4 county precincts, and depending on where you live is going to determine which county commissioner you're going to be able to vote for. Now, the problem with that, though, is that the counties do not have the right to change that. When it says most restricted, what I mean by that is every county in Texas has the same exact type of county government setup. You've got 1 county judge and 4 county commissioners, and the counties are divided up into 4 precincts. We're going to talk later about how there's some criticism for that, because that creates a situation where, when you got a huge county like Harris County, where you've got I think about 2 million people living in Harris County, so that would mean that you have to, each county commissioner has to be responsible for 500,000 people, 500,000 people. But then let's say you go to a more rural county, like Kennedy County over here north of Willacy County, where there's more cows than people there. You still have to have a county judge and 4 county commissioners. So a county commissioner in Kennedy County, that's interesting, right? Okay, I'm responsible for for less than a classroom size of people. So it's, like I said, more cows than people. So you can see how that could be something where, some people have said, well, does it really need to be that way? Does Kennedy County really need 4 county commissioners? And couldn't Harris County maybe use a few more? But again, we'll talk more about that as we continue forward. Special districts are limited purpose districts in terms of, they have limited purposes in local government, and they do have taxing authority. So school districts are considered the best example of this, because they're the most pronounced of special districts, because they're the most visible. But again, they are limited purpose because, the main goal of special districts is education, right? And of course, there are lots of positions and responsibilities that go with education. That's why most school districts have their own district police, because security is something that's important in a school setting, especially with all the school shootings that have been going on, unfortunately. So that is why they do have the right to have police officers there, as well as they have business personnel for payroll and all that, because it's an organization. So they do have the right to be able to have those positions for the purpose of maintaining so that the district can operate. And then the main purpose of the district is to educate students and things like that. And they do have taxing authority, right? The school districts do that's how the school districts are mostly funded in Texas, through property taxes, and that's where the districts are able to get a lot of their money. Suffered temporal transition provisions due to conflict. Okay, well, I want to get through this really quickly, so that's not going to take too long. So let's kind of get this really quickly, because I know it's already 2:23. So let me go ahead, and I do have that meeting I have to go to. So let's go ahead and end here with the amendment process, and then we'll go ahead and finish for today. Okay, so the amendment process in Texas, this is what it's talking about here. In order to amend the state constitution, this is the process that has to occur. So proposals for amending the constitution can occur in a regular session or in a special session. It needs a 2/3 majority approval from both the state house and the state senate. So both the chambers have to vote over 2/3 to propose this state amendment to the constitution. Then once that happens, the governor's not involved in this process. I mean, the governor, of course, can lobby for it, and the governor can call for amendments to the constitution, but the governor cannot actually be involved in the actual voting process, right? So it skips the governor. The governor cannot veto a constitutional amendment. The governor cannot say, no, I don't want this constitutional amendment going to the people. So again, it needs a 2/3 majority approval from both the state and from the state house and the state senate. Then once that gets approved, then the legislature chooses the date of the election. That's usually in November, usually coincides with the national election date. It's not going to be, though, on the same day as the presidential election, because remember, the legislature does not meet in even numbered years. So last year in 2023, the legislature met, and then we had the constitutional amendment election in November of last year. So again, that's when it'll happen. It's going to happen in the odd numbered years, usually, after the legislature adjourns there earlier in the year. The proposed amendments must be published once a week for 4 weeks in every county. It's usually done in the newspapers, where they have a section where they advertise it. And then a simple majority passes the amendment. So you don't need a 2/3 vote to amend the state constitution. You just need a simple majority. And you can see here, and this is a little bit outdated because we've also had several other amendments that have passed in more recent years. So it is over 500 now, but it's probably closer to more like 30, I think. So we've had over 700 amendments that have been proposed. So as you can see, the majority of amendments end up getting passed. I don't know if any of y'all have ever voted in these constitutional amendments. I know, like last November, I did vote in some, and I'm not gonna lie, some of the provisions in there were kind of difficult to understand because they're written, like I said, the way it's written again, like it's lawyer speak, right? It's written in the way that, if you look at like the way that the state constitution is, there's a lot of these definitions and it's a legal document. So I understand why it's written that way. But what people need to understand is that does the general public, are they able to understand that? So again, that's a criticism I've had personally in terms of like, that I would like to see like, like a little bit of a description of it, a little bit of a summary of it also added to it. So that's something that I don't know. It is what it is. But I'm just going to, as someone who's very educated, I have trouble, understanding some of these amendments sometimes because it's a lot of like really legal jargon. So I don't know. See what y'all think about that. I mean, that's kind of like how I just wanted to give like a little of my personal thoughts on that. But yeah, so you can see that a lot of these overwhelmingly get passed through. So okay, so let's go to an end for today because I do have to go to that meeting really quick. Let me stop the share. And let's go ahead and end here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording here.